Welcome, everyone, to the Fantasy and Betting Podcast presented by the 33rd Team. I am your host, as always, Josh Larky, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Ryan Reynolds. What we're going to be doing is recapping all the Week 1 games that have happened with an eye towards Week 2. If we look ahead to Week 2, the Thursday night matchup is the Eagles against the Vikings. A couple fantasy notes from the Eagles. Kenneth Gainwell, surprisingly, 14 of 16 running back carries. He had all 3 of their red zone attempts, and he even ran more routes than Swift, 16 to 13. I know that Gainwell didn't really do all that much with those touches, but he did have 14 expected fantasy points, which was one of the highest marks of the day. In the passing game, A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith each had 10 targets. Dallas Goedert ran 35 routes, which was in line with Smith and Brown. But Dallas Goedert had 1 target with no catch. I wouldn't say either of us are particularly concerned with Dallas Goedert, but it is something to keep an eye on. And then with Minnesota, Alexander Mattison did have 11 of the team's 14 running back carries. He had all the red zone and goal line attempts, and he ran 25 routes in the pass game to Ty Chandler's 7. But the 11 carries were 34 rushing yards. The 3 receptions were for 10 yards. I watched the touchdown reception. It was manufactured to him, which I think we could see as a positive in terms of they were getting Madison involved at the goal line. But I think the negative is that there was nothing about this performance that made me think that there's a stranglehold on the backfield for Alexander Mattison. So this is just going to be one that we keep revisiting each week. And then I believe there's going to be a changing of the guard at receiver next week. Week 1, KJ Osborne ran more routes than Jordan Addison. Both had 6 targets. Jordan Addison was far more productive. He even had both of the team's end zone targets. Just imagine what Addison's going to do when he actually gets a full snap share. And then TJ Hawkinson might have been the only elite tight end that actually did something. And by did something, I mean he had 9 targets and caught 8 of them for 35 yards. Ryan, talk to me about some observations that you had about the Eagles and the Vikings.
Yeah, first that game in New England was closer than the score looked, especially for the Eagles offense. Eagles scored a defensive touchdown. The Patriots also fumbled on their end right after it, which is why Philadelphia got off to, I think it was a 16-0 lead. But the offense didn't really play all that well. Eagles defense, on the other hand, especially their front, Jalen Carter's already a difference maker. He had a sack, a handful of pressures. You know, he's going to step right in for Hargrave, and he's already like a similar type talent at this point. And then from the Minnesota angle, you know, we talked about this in Discord with Survivor Pool. I wanted to stay away from him. Not a super surprising loss, even though it's a bad one for them. And, you know, on offense, it just looks, and we expected this coming in, looks like a one-dimensional offense where, you know, if they don't have great success through the air, you know, they're kind of pigeonholed into that. So I think Minnesota's probably in trouble on Thursday night, especially on the road.
Guys, Ryan is at Ryan Reynolds NFL on Twitter. Let's turn to another upcoming game for Week 2, which would be the San Francisco 49ers against the Los Angeles Rams. If we look at the 49ers, Brock Purdy had 29 pass attempts, 220 passing yards. That's pretty good. 7.5 yards per attempt. But one thing that we discussed and that I would say hit is the pass yards under. We were line shopping and we really liked that Brock Purdy's passing yards was a lot higher. It was at 237.5. Most books had it at 232.5 or 234.5. We took that under 237.5 on my bookie while we were line shopping. And if you go to mybookie.com and use the promo code 33rd team, you help Ryan and I stay employed. And you also get a 10% deposit match. So if you put in $200 into their platform, they automatically just gift you $20 as a, hey, thanks for signing up. Let's have some fun betting. So we have now added them to our portfolio for the 2023 season. And there are potential very good Monday Night Football lines. We'll post those into our free Discord if we find them. Some discrepancies already with Breece Hall and his rushing yards for this upcoming game. Now, a lot of people were very excited about Brandon Ayuk. I was as well. He caught all 8 of his targets for 129 yards and 2 receiving touchdowns. He had 2 end zone targets. Good for him, converting on both of those. He finished with 33 fantasy points. The expected fantasy points tell a different story. He was kind of expected to have 17 and a half fantasy points, which is still a great day. And Deebo Samuel was expected to have 11 and a half fantasy points. So even though it was a wild difference in the box score, their usage wasn't all that different. 8 targets for Ayuk, 7 for Deebo. While Ayuk did have 109 air yards, Deebo Samuel's ADOT was also very respectable at 10 yards per target. George Kittle did have the 21% target share, 3 catches, 19 yards. I think he's fine. And then if we turn to the Rams, first off, we have to give a shout out to our own waivers guy, Nick Botiford. He's been more into Puka Nacua than the two of us have. And I think very early on, we can accept that we were at least mostly partially wrong with Puka. Sets a record with 10 catches, 119 yards. That's the best debut by a round 5 rookie receiver that's ever happened by quite a bit. Those 22 fantasy points, very, very impressive. The other guy to note would be Tutu Atwell. He also had 119 receiving yards. It appears, at least early for fantasy, that Van Jefferson, regardless of who's in, who's out, is a field stretcher. Puka Nacua, Tutu Atwell, the target earners. In the backfield, Cam Akers looked atrocious. 22 carries for 29 yards, feels made up. Kyren Williams had 15 carries for 52 yards, so he's much more efficient. And Kyren Williams actually had 5 of the team's 7 red zone rush attempts, even though he's small. So that was a very interesting development. And then Kyren Williams had 28 routes run to Akers 2. I am pushing the full panic button on Cam Akers. Ryan, is this kind of what you saw as well, that Kyren Williams looks like the better fantasy asset potentially? And talk through what you saw from Matthew Stafford, who had 334 passing yards without Cooper Kupp.
Yeah, I mean, for the running back group, I couldn't tell the difference between Kyren Williams and Cam Akers, and that's not really a compliment or a discouraging thing for both of them. They're just guys to me. That said, Kyren Williams played a lot early, so I'm not sure that's going to be sticky, but maybe it is. Not super interested in either one of them, really.
What else did you see from the Niners? Oh, keep going with Stafford. Sorry.
Right, yeah. For Stafford, he's still at least a borderline Hall of Fame talent. He carried that game. He did a lot with very little. This was the Rams were the biggest surprise to me last week. I got a few things wrong with that one. I did not see that coming at all. That's a game I'll actually watch the all 22 on later this week when it's out. And for the 49ers, again, I got that game wrong too. Those were my 2 big misses this week. But Brock Purdy, man, he still went under his passing yards limit, but he played very, very well in a muddy pocket. He was a difference in that game. Played well in pressure situations. Like you said, Brandon Ayuk is his guy. Not only did, Ayuk create separation number of areas, Brock Purdy gave him a few 50-50 balls, which means he has complete confidence in him. Real good looking thing there. And then on top of it, the 49ers defense is the same. They literally gave Kenny Pickett no room to do anything. Pass rush, secondary. There was very little margin there. 49ers defense is probably the best defense in football.
We thought they were going to be the best defense. They are still the best defense in football. And guys, one more time, reminder to check out mybookie.com, promo code 33team. Keep us employed. Another great place that you can be line shopping for the props that will be dropping into our free Discord throughout the week. Now let's move on to some of the very exciting games on this main slate. Let's start off with Jaguars Chiefs. That's a very exciting week 2 matchup. If we look at the Jaguars in week 1, Trevor Lawrence had a decent stat line, 240 pass yards, 2 passing touchdowns. I was very encouraged by his 7 carries for 21 yards on the ground. The rushing that helped him last year and his rookie season seems to still be there in year 3. For the running backs, Travis Etienne's the absolute bell cow, aside from the goal line carries, which is unfortunate. Etienne still looks like a low-end fantasy RB1, but both of the goal line attempts went to Tank Bigsby. Etienne still finished with 18 carries, 5 targets. The 5 receptions were a career high for him in the NFL. And then in the pass game, I'm officially panicking on Christian Kirk. He ran significantly fewer routes than Zay Jones. Christian Kirk looks like the 4th option in this pass game, behind Ridley, Zay Jones, and Evan Engram, maybe even the 5th if Travis Etienne's pass game usage from week 1 holds. So I'm not dropping Christian Kirk. I want to see at least one more week, but I think he's like a 9 or 10 out of 10 on the concern meter for me. And then if we turn to the Chiefs, God, this backfield was a mess. It was kind of fun to see Isaiah Pacheco run more routes than Jerick McKinnon. The only problem was he had 8 carries to Clyde Edwards-Helaire's 6. Very hard to have consistent fantasy production when it's a uniquely weird 3-headed backfield. In the pass game, I'm going to give Sky Moore 1 week before I cut him. He ran the second most routes on the team, but he only commanded 3 targets. He didn't catch anything. Kadarius Toney had 5 targets on 11 routes. That's insane. He's the ultimate wild card. We love the targets per route run. We love what he can do after the catch. He is an absolute head case. He was trolling the Giants throughout yesterday's game on social media. And you might say, what social media? He was doing it on Instagram because the team took away his Twitter. He does not tweet anymore. It was either his agent or the team said no more Twitter. So he decides to hop on Instagram. Truly the craziest personality out there. A supreme talent. I'm not dropping him yet, but like Sky Moore, I think we give him 1 more week to see if he can rebound. And then Rashee Rice remains an excellent bench stash. He only ran 12 routes. We're not starting him in week 2, but the rookie did catch 3 of them for 29 yards. And he had one of the team's 2 end zone targets, which he converted to a touchdown. What else do you want to add about the Jaguars and the Chiefs ahead of their week 2 matchup?
I mean, the Chiefs defense didn't have Chris Jones, and they still played very well against the Lions. The Chiefs wide receivers, on the other hand, essentially cost them that game. We talked about Sky Moore. We like this potential opportunity, but, as you know, Josh, I've never been crazy as him as a talent. And when I ask the question, what does he do well? I still don't see anything. So I don't really think that they have a top end option there outside of Kelsey, obviously. So I still have some interest in him, but he really doesn't look like he's a difference-making player at this point. Now, on the Jaguar side of things, Trevor Lawrence threw an interception last week. It wasn't his fault. It was a tip pass. Rookie right tackle Anton Harrison looks like he could be a bit of a liability early in his career. The Chiefs, George Karlaftis could potentially give him problems, but when they play a real pass rusher down the line, I could see that being a game-breaking factor potentially for them. Jaguars pass rush, their edge rush, do it on their own. They could be a potential factor in this game, especially if Jawan Taylor is no longer allowed to line up in the slot and jump early in this contest like he was on Thursday night. And, the one thing here, like Patrick Mahomes is in a classic bounce back spot. The Jaguars secondary is pretty brutal. So I could see him really carving them up in a game with a lot of high scoring potential.
Guys, that is Ryan Reynolds NFL on Twitter. He's watched every snap of every game for nearly the past decade and lives to tell about it.
Yeah.
Let's turn to a fun divisional matchup in week 2, the Cincinnati Bengals against the Baltimore Ravens. Ryan, I'm just going to throw this right to you. Do we panic on Joe Burrow? 82 passing yards, bad weather game. What did you see here from himself and that Bengals offensive line?
Yeah, like you said, it was a opening day rainy game. Like if it was November 10th and it was raining, like whatever. These guys are battle hardened by this point. Opening day, it's an unwanted variable. And Jordan Vanek said this on Twitter. I had the same thought while watching last night's game. The Cleveland Browns pass rush and secondary look a lot like the Cowboys. So maybe the Browns just have a top 5 defense. They certainly looked like it on opening day. I think Joe Burrow's earned the benefit of the doubt where we'll give him a mulligan for last week.
I think so too. I'm also going to give a mulligan to T. Higgins. T. Higgins had no catches. Everyone's pissed, but he did have 8 targets. Jamar Chase had 9. We can relax on T. Higgins. At running back with the Bengals, Travion Williams was the RB2 behind Joe Mixon. He's hurt. He doesn't play in the preseason. He never played his first 3 seasons, so of course he's going to start ahead of Chris Evans on the depth chart. I want 1 more week to see how things continue to shake out. I'm not dropping Chris Evans. He does look like the current RB3. More so in deeper leagues, I'm picking up Travion Williams as well. I think he stinks, but if you're going to be on the field with Joe Burrow, good things for fantasy can happen. And then on the Ravens end, Lamar Jackson was very efficient. There was no volume. I'm going to assume part of it was due to Mark Andrews being out. He did complete 77% of his passes, but when you only throw 22 times, the 169 passing yards, no passing touchdowns, left a lot to be desired. He also had 6 rush attempts for 38 yards on the ground. That's one of the lowest rushing marks he's had over the past few seasons. What did you see from Lamar in his first game with new offensive coordinator Todd Monken?
I mean, he threw a bad pick early on, and we've heard all offseason, they're going to be so aggressive in the air, this and that, and I was not very impressed against the Houston team. Although Texans defense played well, but I didn't see anything to get excited about. That said, last year, when the Ravens and Bengals played, 2 pretty close games, low-scoring games. The year before, some pretty high-scoring bouts. So I think there's some potential for both offenses to take a step up this week.
In the running back realm, JK Dobbins tore his Achilles. Some of the worst injury luck that I can remember. Justice Hill got all the high volume touches, which is surprising. He's 200 pounds. Gus Edwards is 240 pounds. Yet all 4 red zone carries, and both of them at the goal line, they went to Justice Hill, not Gus Edwards. Even still, though, Justice Hill was not running a lot of routes. It was almost like he was used like a Gus Edwards. He's just tiny. I'm picking him up on waivers. Our own Nick Bodiford wrote him up for the week 2 waiver wire column. Ryan, correct me if I'm wrong, but I wouldn't actually say, despite the JK Dobbins injury, that Justice Hill feels like the absolute clear-cut highest priority waiver ad. Is that kind of where you're at with him as well?
Yeah, I think they'll probably split between the two of them, but Hill, probably sees more passing down work, which Monken actually wants. So I'd give Hill a lean over Edwards. Not sure he's the top waiver ad, though.
Yeah, there's a little bit of murkiness there. Where there is not murkiness, Zay Flowers is the real deal. It's hard to fake a 46% target share in your first NFL game. The Lamar Jackson threw 4 passes in the red zone. All 4 of them were to Zay Flowers. That is very, very encouraging usage. His 10 targets led the team by a wide margin. He caught 9 of them for 78 yards. I think Zay Flowers has already vaulted himself into wide receiver 2 type territory. I'm going to say low-end wide receiver 2 just because we expect Mark Andrews back next week. But I think the runway's at least cleared at this point for Zay Flowers to look like one of those signature difference-making rookie receivers that has the draft capital. What else do you want to add about either the Bengals outside of Joe Burrow or the Ravens and their defense?
Yeah, I mean, let me say this about the Bengals defense, actually. I think the Ravens defense was fine against Houston, but, obviously this is a major, rising class against the Bengals, especially in a, classic bounce back spot for Burrow. But what I'll say about the Bengals defense is that Deshaun Watson played well. Score this could have even been more lopsided, like 35. We're talking 35-3. So I think there's a chance for Lamar Jackson and the Ravens offense to have a better outing against Cleveland this week. But we'll see. We'll see what happens.
We will indeed. Can't get worse than last week for Joe Burrow and company. Let's turn to another quite interesting game, the Tennessee Titans against the Los Angeles Chargers. With Tennessee, we can turn immediately to the running game. Tajay Spears outsnapped Derrick Henry 33-28. But Derrick Henry had 15 of the 18 running back carries between the two of them. And while Tajay Spears ran 20 routes to Henry's 9 and was targeted 4 times to Henry's 3, Henry was the one that caught 2 of his passes for 56 receiving yards. I know you and I were big dog enthusiasts during the offseason, so it was at least good to see that some type of receiving workload is still going to be there each week for him. And then in the pass game, I think at this point, I know it's early in the season, but I'm almost ready to proclaim that DeAndre Hopkins is the same Hopkins that we kind of thought he'd be. 38% target share, 13 targets, caught 7 for 65. He had 2 of the team's 4 red zone targets. I'm not super interested for week 2 and beyond with Treylon Burks. I'm going to give him a little more time, but when he leads the team with 37 routes and gets targeted only 3 times, that is less than ideal. Chigoziem Okonkwo's 30 routes. Top of my head, I believe that is a career high. And he didn't catch either of his targets. Extremely disappointing. And I think that shows why small sample tight end usage can be a little bit of a trap. The most efficient tight end in the NFL last year, currently pacing to be among the league's least efficient. On the Chargers side, the vaunted Kellen Moore offense led to 33 pass attempts for Justin Herbert and 32 carries for Austin Eckler and Josh Kelly. Tough loss for the Chargers. You have to wonder if they opened it up more in the passing game, if that would have portended better things. When we look at the running backs, both had 16 carries, Eckler and Josh Kelly. Eckler was the one who did have the 5 targets. He caught 4 of them for 47 yards. It's all very exciting. 26 fantasy points for Eckler. Except when we dig a little bit deeper, it was actually kind of a true committee. So not only did they each rush 16 times, Josh Kelly ran 15 routes to Eckler's 23. I'm very happy with what Eckler did in week 1. I'm not necessarily worried, but I think at this point, Josh Kelly looks like potentially the number 1 waiver ad right now, considering it's the Chargers offense and the guy ultimately had 17 opportunities in week 1. Receiver usage, I think a couple things to note. Josh Palmer started over Quentin Johnston as expected. Quentin Johnston outproduced him on significantly fewer routes. That might flip in the next week or two. And Gerald Everett and Donald Parham are in a full tight end committee. You can drop Gerald Everett in fantasy. What other notes do you have about the Titans and the Chargers?
Yeah, from a macro sense, the Chargers offense was very good last week, but their defense was once again the problem. They can't close games against real offenses. That continues to be a trend, which, it's keeping them from being an elite team. Offensive line's pretty well positioned to mitigate the Titans front. The Titans front had a big impact against the Saints last week. I think that's more of a draw against, a strength versus strength type matchup. Could see Herbert blowing up the Titans through the air, though. Derek Carr had a pretty good game against Tennessee's pass or secondary, rather. Could see Herbert doing some real damage in that phase. We talk about this all the time. Chargers run defense has been a sieve under Brandon Staley on purpose. Obviously, that makes this a good matchup for Derrick Henry. And, you alluded to this. Ryan Tannehill had a pretty tough game in New Orleans last week. If Tennessee's going to hang with a team like the Chargers, he needs to be much more effective than he was last week.
Yeah, no touchdown passes, 3 passes to the other team in the form of interceptions. Let's move on to the next game, which is the Detroit Lions against the Seattle Seahawks. Detroit will start with the backfield. David Montgomery, we love it. 21 carries, ran 19 routes. Wasn't targeted on his 19 routes, but we do like the usage there. Jahmyr Gibbs was said to be eased in, and he definitely was. He only had 7 carries, and he only ran 9 routes. He was targeted twice. Ultimately, though, Jahmyr Gibbs finished with 60 yards on 9 touches. That is excellent. I don't quite know when the fantasy points are going to come, but for anyone panicking out there, I, in 0 ways, am trying to get rid of Gibbs. If I have him in fantasy, I'd actually be trying to acquire him, where I think the split becomes a little more even. And he looked like potentially the second most dynamic player this in week 1 in the NFL, behind maybe Tyreek Hill, in terms of what we saw from Gibbs. And Josh Reynolds, I think until Jameson Williams comes back, looks like their wide receiver too. He's kind of a desperation flex at this point. I did like that Josh Reynolds was targeted 7 times. Amon-Ra was targeted 9 times. Reynolds caught 4 for 80 yards. That's at least semi-exciting in the flex. Sam Laporta might be a low-end tight end 1, at least early in the season, until they figure out who their wide receiver 2 is. But I think we're going to play a little more wait and see there. Let's turn to the Seahawks. We loved the Seahawks all offseason. This was not the kind of game we expected or wanted to see. Geno Smith had 4.3 yards per attempt, finished with 112 passing yards. What did you see from Geno Smith throwing against practice squad caliber defenders on the Rams? And is there any hope for the Seahawks after the most disappointing team performance in week 1, bar none?
Yeah, man. I mean, we talked about it all offseason. Like, if the Seahawks are going to fail this year, it's probably because Geno Smith turns back into a pumpkin, and we're on, turning back into a pumpkin watch here with Geno Smith is how I'd answer that question. I don't want to say he had the worst week 1 because, Joe Burrow bombed the Giants, got eviscerated. But, I mean, against that the Rams defense, maybe they're just better than everyone anticipated. Maybe all these unknowns, they're a well-coached team. But I am definitely concerned about Geno Smith, especially heading into this week against a Lions team who just beat the Chiefs.
Yeah. I would say in the running back room, Kenneth Walker is an absolute bell cow. He had 5 targets. He ran more routes than Charbonnet. Charbonnet never had a target. And Kenneth Walker had 12 carries to Charbonnet's 3. It is clear that Walker is a fantasy RB1 and Charbonnet is just a bench stash. And then, as expected, DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett were the 2 starters in 2 wide receiver sets. Jackson Smith and Jigba played a complimentary wide receiver 3 role in this one. Any other thoughts on the Lions' stunning victory or the Seahawks' epic collapse?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts, actually. Like, Detroit's good. They're an ascending team. They can be a factor in the NFC. I don't want to take anything away from their win on opening night, but I don't also want to overreact to it. They scored 14 points on offense. The Chiefs dropped 8 passes, so their defense played well, but I think in a lot of scenarios that ends up being like a 31-21 game Chiefs, So that's I feel like that one played more like that than what the score would indicate. Now, to that said, Chiefs defense played well. Against Seattle, especially this week. I mean, their defense is definitely more talented than the Rams, so I could see a repeat performance, especially on a long week. And I mean, the Seahawks offense was very concerning, especially their passing attack, but their defense. I mean, Puka Nacua, who, again, give all the credit in the world to Nick Botiford for being on him, where we were a little bit tepid on that. And I still don't think he's some great talent, but Matthew Stafford shredded them with, that's a pretty dicey receiver room they walked into opening day with, and they literally shredded the Seahawks, who their secondary was kind of the strength of the team. So, maybe they bounce back this week. They certainly have the talent to do so, but in a lot of spots, like I think Cincinnati's going to bounce back, for instance. I'm a little bit more concerned about Seattle here.
Yeah, I'd agree too. Let's turn to the Falcons against the Packers for week 2. So if we look at the Falcons from week 1, Desmond Ridder was in one of the more extreme game manager roles. He only attempted 18 passes for 115 yards. More concerning in some ways was the 63 air yards. He was essentially averaging about 3 yards through the air per pass attempt. And Ridder, despite running a 4.5, ran one time for -1 yard. What did you see from Desmond Ridder in this extreme game manager type role?
I mean, general, like the Falcons looked like a team that could be a real threat if they had, we've been talking about, if they had Matthew Stafford, this team could come out of the NFC East, or the NFC rather. Unfortunately, Ridder, like you said, game manager, he had one great deep shot to Kyle Pitts, like a drop in tight coverage, but he looks like a game manager, and that's it.
When we look at the Falcons running backs, this was about as encouraging of a debut for Bijan Robinson as possible. And the pure box score people will say, what are you talking about? Tyler Algier had 15 carries to Bijan's 10, and Tyler Algier had 24 fantasy points to Bijan's 20. Well, this was kind of a blowout game against the Panthers. The Panthers, who we'll talk about shortly, had nothing going on offense, and Tyler Algier outcarried Bijan Robinson 9-1 in the fourth quarter. So prior to the fourth quarter, Bijan had 10 carries. Algier only had 6. And while Algier had 3 goal line carries to Bijan's 0, all 3 of those came in the fourth quarter. So I think what we can say is Algier, great waiver pickup. I think it's probably him and Josh Kelly fighting potentially for who the best pickup of the week is in some ways. Bijan, though, looks like who we thought he'd be, an elite fantasy RB1. I'm panicking on Drake London. He was targeted once. He didn't catch the ball. It was kind of why I was off of him all summer. I did not like the passing expectations for this team. Kyle Pitts was the clear leading receiver with 3 targets, and he caught 2 for 44 yards. You can keep starting Pitts because he plays tight end. Drake London, I am putting on my fantasy bench ahead of their matchup with Green Bay. And when we turn to Green Bay, Jordan Love, we liked the 245 passing yards. We liked that he threw 3 touchdowns and no picks. But he only completed 55% of his passes, and it was against the Bears, who have one of the worst pass defenses. And when we look at the running back room, my sell high of the week is Aaron Jones. You might be like, why Aaron Jones? Aaron Jones had 27 fantasy points. Well, A.J. Dillon had 13 carries to Jones's 9, and Dillon had 10 routes run to Aaron Jones's 16. Jones had 4 targets to Dillon's 3. They were very neck and neck there. Jones is obviously the better, more explosive player. I highly doubt Aaron Jones is going to catch 2 passes for 86 yards every Sunday. I highly doubt that Jones is always going to be the one scoring the rushing touchdowns when more of the goal line attempts actually went to A.J. Dillon in this one, as opposed to Aaron Jones. The receiving core, Romeo Doubs and Jaden Reed had similar usage. I actually prefer Jaden Reed in many ways because I don't really care all that much that Romeo Doubs caught both touchdowns. Luke Musgrave might be a low-end tight end one. We'll put him in the Sam Laporta zone. Athletic rookie, not too much target competition, but I want to see another week or two. So these are players I'm considering stashing. What else do you want to add about the Falcons? And then what did you see from Jordan Love and the Packers?
I think Atlanta has the best running game in football, actually. Top 10 offensive line. Both players look really, really good. In particular with Robinson, how they used him in the passing game is very, very interesting. Algier's the typical grinder back, thumper back, really good in that role, where Robinson's just so versatile and fluid. I don't want to say he reminds me of Todd Gurley because he doesn't quite. He's like a better Todd Gurley, if that makes sense. So I'm very excited to see what they continue to do with him. Falcons defense was pretty good. Pass rush was effective. Jesse Bates was, pretty much the difference in this game. Big signing from the Bengals, paying huge dividends already. Now for Green Bay, I talked about this a lot this offseason with Green Bay. If their defense plays to their potential, they could be a playoff team, and they certainly did in Chicago. Played excellent last week. I thought they were the difference in that game. Jordan Love, he played well. Don't get me wrong. I like what he did. I'm not probably as excited as some people are about what he did because I think that had more to do with the Bears defense than anything else.
Yeah.
But the Packers have a pretty easy opening schedule, so he has a chance to build some momentum here, put some good stuff on the stat sheet over the next few weeks. So, at least in the short term, Jordan Love's doing what they need to do to win.
Yeah, just to echo what you said, Bijan Robinson led the team with 6 targets and with 6 catches, only 27 yards, but it's still him being that involved in the pass game is certainly encouraging. Next game that is coming up for week 2 would be the Buffalo Bills against the Raiders. We have little to say about the Buffalo Bills because they play against the New York Jets tonight on Monday Night Football. Looking at the Raiders, Jimmy Garoppolo put on his best San Francisco Jimmy Garoppolo impression, completes 77% of his passes at nearly 8 yards per attempt. When we look at the running room, Josh Jacobs handles 19 of 20 running back carries. He ran more routes than Amir Abdullah. This is all very encouraging for Josh Jacobs on a week-to-week basis. I still think you're playing with fire, given that he had 393 touches last year, but at least last year's role looks to be holding firm for this year. It's a big 2 in Las Vegas. Devontae Adams and Jacoby Myers, they combined for 19 targets. Myers actually out-targeted him 10-9. Myers is the one that caught 9 for 81 and 2 touchdowns. Adams is still the wide receiver 1 here. I don't think anyone should be overreacting. I don't think anyone is overreacting, but I don't think it's an overreaction to scoop up Jacoby Myers on waivers. He should be on nearly every waiver wire at this point. And I think it might just be a big 2 in Vegas where there's no more Darren Waller and that maybe Jacoby Myers is just that number 2 where the passes are going to be funneled. Is that kind of how you're viewing the Raiders? And what else did you see from this team against the Broncos in week 1?
Yeah, it certainly seems to be their intention. They paid Jacoby Myers pretty good money and they traded Darren Waller. So it seems like that's the game plan going here. And, leading into this week, I wrote in, my various betting pieces. I thought the Raiders were going to cover. I wouldn't be surprised if they pulled out a win and that's what happens. But the Jimmy Garoppolo enthusiasm that I'm seeing, listen, they scored 17 points against a division team, man. He was good, don't get me wrong, but I don't think the Raiders are going to be holding a lot of teams to 16 points. And when they play Buffalo this week, unless something happens to Josh Allen, Jimmy Garoppolo is probably going to have to score more than 17 points to hang. So, yeah, not really surprised. I think they're going to be in trouble the next 3 games, the Raiders.
Guys, that is Ryan Reynolds, NFL on Twitter. He'll have his game previews coming out over the next few days for week 2. Make sure to check that out. He's finishing up his power rankings as well. We'll see how far the Bengals fall. We'll see how far the Seahawks fall. We'll see how high the Tampa Bay Buccaneers rise. Ryan, what did you see from Baker Mayfield? He's now 1-0 as the Buccaneers starting quarterback.
I mean, to his credit, and I'm not a Baker Mayfield guy, so to his credit, when he got traded to the Rams last year, he gave them a few gritty performances in a row, like coming off the street, basically. He gave the Buccaneers a gritty performance in Minnesota, but I'd say their defense pretty much won that game. But yeah, not a whole lot of enthusiasm for Baker going forward.
We can be a little more enthusiastic, at least about Chris Godwin and Mike Evans. They were the 2 clear top options in the pass game as expected. And this week 2 matchup against the Chicago Bears, they get yet another easy secondary. I will be starting both of them where I have them. Running backs. Rachaad White was awful. 17 carries, 39 yards. I looked at next gen stats and hard to believe, but Rachaad White was the worst runner this past week with -2.5 rushing yards below 2.5 rushing yards below expectation per attempt. I don't even know how that's possible. You're more the film guy than I am. Does that check out with what you saw? That Rachaad White was essentially doing the least with the least as well.
Yeah, I've never really liked him as a talent, so it doesn't really surprise me. And yeah, that's how it looked on Sunday too. Yeah.
So he had a great role, 17 carries, right. 21 routes run. Sean Tucker carried 5 times and ran 4 routes. But I think Sean Tucker remains an excellent stash because what we said, that Rachaad White is currently the starter in name only. I think he's on very shaky ground. Turning to the Bears, Justin Fields struggled again as a passer, just like last year. He does pass 37 times. That's encouraging volume. It's only 216 passing yards. That's under 6 yards per attempt. And a hallmark of last year continues into this year, the outrageous sack rate. He took 4 sacks once again. At least he chipped in 9 carries and 59 rushing yards on the ground. Anything that you want to add about Justin Fields and how it does not seem like he made progress from year 2 to year 3 as a passer?
Yeah, I think that's the story. I mean, they looked fine early. He's still is what he is. He has his flash. It's just a matter of being consistent, and he wasn't again. And it's got to be disappointing for anyone who is even mildly bullish on the Bears or Justin Fields.
We shouldn't be starting Khalil Herbert. I know the two of us were optimistic, at least for week 1, and that did not happen. Many people are excited about Roschon Johnson. Roschon Johnson is an excellent stash. He didn't do anything until the second half of the game once it was out of way. There were 0 carries and 0 targets on the stat sheet for Roschon Johnson until the second half, when he did finish with 5 carries for 20 yards and a touchdown, and he caught 6 of 7 targets for 35 yards. That feels to me like he has excellent handcuff appeal. But again, if you're not going to touch the ball in the first half, I'm probably not going to start you in fantasy football. And if we turn to the receivers, DJ Moore's very anticipated debut had him catching both targets for 25 yards. That's not exciting. Cole Kmet and Darnell Mooney paced this receiving room in targets with 7 apiece. I am not going to start any Bears other than maybe DJ Moore. Again, I'll probably give him the benefit of the doubt. And with how much of a wasteland tight end is, no tight end hit 60 receiving yards in week 1. Hard to believe. That I might as well just start Cole Kmet, who caught 5 of 7 targets for 44 yards. He didn't score, but he did have 2 red zone targets. One of those actually came in the end zone. Anything else to add to the Bucs or Bears before we move to our next game?
I mean, what I'd say about the Bucs win is you got to give them credit. Going into Minnesota and stealing a win's a good thing for that team, but I think it had more to do with Minnesota than themselves in a lot of ways. Defense played reasonably well. Offense, like we said, not super impressive against the Vikings defense, where got shredded by Mac Jones, got shredded by Daniel Jones, who got shredded out by the Cowboys last night. So, I'd keep that. I'd keep that in perspective. That said, my biggest concern with the Bears actually isn't their offense. It's their defense. Doesn't look like they got better. So there's a real chance that Tampa starts 2-0 because of the Bears defense.
There really is. Guys, my fantasy rankings are going to be up on the 33rdteam.com tomorrow. They will be free to view. If you want to see how I'm taking a lot of these insights that Ryan and I are discussing and applying them to fantasy football, you might as well check them out because they're free. And we know that anyone listening is probably in one, if not closer to 5, 10, 15, 20 fantasy leagues. Let's turn to the little divisional matchup between the Houston Texans and Indianapolis Colts. We're going to get 2 rookie quarterbacks battling it out. I'm going to kick it right to you for Houston with CJ Stroud. He dropped back 52 times. Maybe they trust him. Completed 28 of 44 pass attempts, 242 yards passing, no touchdowns, no turnovers, 4 carries, 20 yards on the ground. That's a little bit exciting. They were playing a lot of 3 receiver sets with Noah Brown, Robert Woods, Nico Collins. What did you see from CJ Stroud in week 1?
I mean, they were ultra conservative with him early, as they should have been. I mean, Andy Benoit said this, I said this. Making your NFL debut in Baltimore when you have Nico Collins, your number 1 wide receiver, is a pretty tall task. So I thought they kept him safe. It seems like Houston's a well-coached team on both sides of the ball, but I'm not the biggest Stroud guy. I think his ceiling's Dak Prescott. Nothing's changed my mind after 1 week.
In terms of receivers, I think we're allowed to start Robert Woods and Nico Collins. Woods had 10 targets. Collins had 11. They both caught 6 of their targets. Nico Collins was an air yards monster with 158 air yards on his 11 targets. He's the obvious preferred option. I don't think Woods is the worst desperation flex if you're dealing with some injuries or you're a little bit spooked from some of these other stat lines in week 1. It's not like the Colts secondary is particularly special on their own. Dalton Schultz did nothing. 2 catches, 4 yards, but he was an every down player. He ran the most routes on the team with 48. So I wouldn't be dropping him in fantasy despite a very disappointing week 1. In the running room, Dameon Pierce was the workhorse. Devin Singletary was the change of pace back. I wouldn't even give 2 thoughts about Mike Boone. He came in for the 4th quarter once it was a blowout. Now, if we turn to the Colts, Deion Jackson, the running back, was terrible. 13 carries for 14 yards on the ground. He fumbled twice. Yeah, he had 6 targets, but they're probably going to Evan Hull, who dealt with an injury in this game. If he's healthy, I think those targets go to him. And Zach Moss should return for this next week. And it wouldn't even surprise me if those targets just simply go to Zach Moss. Deion Jackson was truly that bad. I think he and Rachaad White can kind of compete for who is the worst running back of week 1. In the pass game, we can start Michael Pittman. I was shocked. He caught 8 of 11 targets for 97 yards and a touchdown. I'm not really all that interested in anyone else receiving wise. Josh Downs could be a fun stash, but I think what we saw in some ways was like a borderline ceiling game from Richardson as a passer, at least early in the season. Kylan Granson is an interesting tight end pickup. He himself had 6 targets and he caught 4 for 39 yards. You're higher on Richardson than I am. What did you see from him in week 1? And you seem to disagree that this was a potential ceiling passing game. What made you optimistic for future weeks from him?
I mean, it's his first game in the NFL. Jacksonville's secondary is probably a bottom 5 secondary, so I think it's possible that it's a ceiling game. But, when he was in Florida, I always thought he was talented in that regard. He just had a poor supporting cast in a lot of ways. So I think consistency could be an issue. Houston just shut down Lamar Jackson in a lot of ways. So, Houston could be a tough matchup for just about anyone sneakily. So I could see less success this week against a better pass defense, but I think the potential's there. I always have. And in the run game, he's not really run reliant, which is interesting. But, Trevor Lawrence told him after the game too, like when you do run, man, like take less contact because it adds up in this league. So it seems like they want him to be a pass first quarterback despite his athletic profile.
Yeah, he did carry 10 times for 40 yards. He did exit the game for one of their goal line packages due to injury when Gardner Minshew had to come in. Anything else that you want to add on the Colts or Texans before we move on to what looks like the worst game in week 2?
Just visually, I mean, the Jonathan Taylor mess, it's very clear how much Richardson and the Colts offense could benefit if he was there. RPOs, just it was almost like a tragedy to watch Deion Jackson play instead of Taylor in his opening day. Like I said, Houston's defense impressed me last week. The score looked like they didn't play well, but their pass rush was pretty good. They held Lamar Jackson to a limited amount of passing yards. I thought they were pretty good. And, the Colts pass rush was actually a little bit better than I expected on the edge. That said, I think it could be because of Antoine Harrison. He was a little dicey. So I'll be curious to see how that works out against the Texans right tackle this week.
The next game will be the Arizona Cardinals facing the New York Football Giants. Great bounce back spot for Daniel Jones after we all saw him get embarrassed on Sunday Night Football against the Cowboys. If we look at the Giants, I'm just going to turn that right over to Ryan. Rant about your team before I hit on the Cardinals.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a big Daniel Jones guy. I like him in fantasy this year. Like you said, I think this is a classic bounce back spot. But, the Sunday night game was weird. Giants had a successful offensive drive. They got a field goal blocked after a drop snap. Can totally change the complexion of that game. Then the Cowboys pass rush just took that contest over. The Cardinals pass rush is on the other side of the spectrum. So, they're in a position to bounce back this week. And if the Giants don't bounce back this week, ladies and gentlemen, they are in trouble.
One of the big head scratchers of the week from the Cardinals, who I'm still not starting any of them in fantasy, except for maybe Zach Ertz. What the heck are they doing? Zach Ertz leads the team with 10 targets. With how bleak tight end is looking as a position right now, I think we can turn to the 32-year-old Zach Ertz as a ray of light in these dark times. And I think you're allowed to start him in week 2 against the Giants. Do you have any other Cardinals thoughts? Former NASA engineer Josh Dobbs did not look good as expected. James Conner got the volume, but I just don't really want to start these Cardinals. I don't see what the ceiling is right now for anyone outside of Zach Ertz.
I mean, this is why I was taking Trey McBride in the last round, because the rebuilding Cardinals probably should be relying on our tight end. They're just using the 32-year-old veteran in the situation they're in. Like, why aren't you finding out what you have in Trey McBride? That said, I could see the Giants pass rush did not play well against Dallas's offensive line. I could see a correction for them too. There's corrections all across the board for me here. If the Giants won this game 27-13, it really wouldn't surprise me.
Wouldn't surprise me either. And we might be attacking some Zach Ertz props. Stay tuned later in the week. I'll be checking out mybookie.com. Promo code 33rd team. I mean, if they said Zach Ertz at 2.5, 3.5 receptions, I might be slamming that over because it looks the same as last year. They are simply going to pepper the 32-year-old with targets. Now let's turn to the Broncos of Denver against the Commanders of Washington. With Denver, it looked like a 1A, 1B committee in the backfield. Javonte Williams has 13 carries to Samaje Perine 8. Javonte Williams had 6 targets to Perine's 4, but Perine actually ran more routes than Javonte Williams, and Perine had 37 receiving yards to Javonte's 5. I think you can start both as kind of low-end RB2, RB3 types in fantasy. I don't really have a strong lean at this point, what's going on there, but it's definitely giving me shades of Javonte Williams, Melvin Gordon, where it's just going to be an annoying committee all season. Marvin Mims, it is still too early. 5th in routes run among the receivers and tight ends, despite no Jerry Jeudy. I'm just not that excited to start any of these Denver pass catchers. Courtland Sutton did lead the way with 13 fantasy points, but it came on catching 4 or 5 targets for 32 yards and a touchdown. How did you feel about Russell Wilson in his first game with Sean Payton? And then we'll just flip it and you can just dive right into Sam Howell and the Commanders.
I mean, for Wilson, looked good early. Then they really didn't do much, for basically the second half of the whole game. So I think there were some positives there. But again, like a home loss to the Raiders, I don't have a whole lot of positive things to say about that. Granted, when Jerry Jeudy returns, that's going to be a boon to this passing attack as well. Sam Howell's about who I expected. We talked about this last week. I went on a rant about how the Cardinals can make this a muddy game, a close game, and, means it's kind of what I was expecting. I think Sam Howell's a 5th-round pick that's super volatile, that really, won a nail-biter at home against the worst team in the league. So not a whole lot of enthusiasm at this point for him.
Yeah, that's kind of what I thought as well. And man, these Sam Howell enthusiasts luck boxed once again to a nice rushing stat line because of the rushing touchdown, but he only ran 2 times for 11 yards. That is not exactly what we want to see from a quarterback like him. Brian Robinson, we talked about it all offseason. Sure enough, he is the bell cow. 19 carries to Gibson's 3. Gibson only ran 17 routes to Brian Robinson's 16, and Robinson even out-targeted him 2-1. Gibson lost a fumble. At this point, I am going to start Brian Robinson in week 2 against Denver, and I will not be starting Antonio Gibson. Got to see more from him. I don't even know if I'm going to start a single Commanders pass catcher, though, in week 2. I didn't really like what I saw, and I kind of want to get your thoughts on if anyone seemed to pop to you. It was Jahan Dotson, Terry McLaurin, Curtis Samuel, all vying for targets and all playing some type of role. A 3-headed receiver monster can work in many offenses, probably not with Sam Howell's offense. And another ridiculous tight end stat line was Logan Thomas with 8 targets. There is something about tight ends in their 30s producing in week 1 this year. So it can be your consolation prize if you swing and miss bidding some fab on a Zach Ertz or trying to scoop him off of waivers. What else did you see here from this Commanders team and their receiving room?
I mean, I think they have a good receiving room. Terry McLaurin's the best of the group to me. I don't like Jahan Dotson as much people do, but he's a perfectly fine wide receiver 2. Curtis Samuel's actually a really strong wide receiver 3. With Logan Thomas, he's an interesting athlete when he's healthy, but again, if I'm a Washington Commanders fan, actually, let me phrase it this way for you guys. I'm a New York Giants fan. Please don't finish with the worst record in the league so you get Caleb Williams going forward. I don't want that at all. I don't want to be the worst team in the division for the next 10 years. So please don't do that.
Let's turn to the Dallas Cowboys against the New York Jets. The New York Jets have not played yet. They'll play on Monday night against the Bills, which comes up in 4.5 hours. There's some math for everyone. Yeah, somewhere around there. Let's talk about the Cowboys, though. I don't even think there's much to talk about, considering how weird this game was. I will note for fantasy that Tony Pollard was the bell cow. 35 snaps in this game. No other running back on the team had more than 8. He carried 14 times for 70 yards, 2 touchdowns, 7 red zone carries. 4 of them actually came within 5 yards of the end zone. Receiving left some to be desired. 3 targets, 2 for 12 receiving. But I think part of that was simply game script. Tight end Jake Ferguson is one to watch. You and I both kind of wondered all offseason if he could be Dalton Schultz. I think he might. He only ran 14 routes. We know this game was crazy, though. Anyone that watched the game knows the Cowboys simply didn't have to pass. But on those 14 routes, he was targeted 7 times. 4 of those targets came in the red zone, 1 in the end zone. He only caught 2 passes for 11 yards. But if we're talking strictly usage, he has the greatest disconnect between his actual stat line and the outrageous usage that he had. What other thoughts do you have about the Cowboys offense? And I think more importantly, do you think this defense is going to be able to stop Aaron Rodgers in week 2?
Yeah, usually when Rodgers struggles, it's against a premium pass rush like this one. It's against, San Francisco. He always struggled against. I don't want to quite call the Dallas defense the 49ers, but it's at least in the same cluster, if not towards the end of that one. But yeah, I could see the Jets offense struggling. We'll see what happens tonight. But they do have like a 20-ish to 25-ish type offensive line, just like the Giants. So I could see Dallas creating similar havoc. Granted, Aaron Jones and Daniel Jones are not synonyms. So we'll see what happens there. To your point with Ferguson, I'll say a few things about Dallas's offense. I do think Ferguson is Dalton Schultz. One of the reasons Dalton Schultz had so much production is because they manufactured a few touches for him every game. I saw 2 or 3 where it looked like it was essentially a play scripted for Dalton Schultz. Pollard had a good night. What's the guy's name? Dinwiddle, the backup running back.
Rico Dowdle.
Yeah. He was better than I was expecting.
Yeah, he looked pretty good.
Even though I murdered the absolute what out of his last name. Offensive line looked good. Brandon Cooks is going to play the role that I expected. I don't think he's going to see a lot of volume, but he's going to be a field stretcher. They're going to take a couple of shots downfield when they're actually in a game that's close. I think they only did one last night. So I picked Dallas to come out of the NFC. I saw nothing last night to get me off that at all.
Let's turn to the Sunday night divisional AFC East matchup. Upcoming Sunday night next week is the New England Patriots against the Miami Dolphins. When we look at New England, Mac Jones completed 35 of 54. I said that correctly. 54 attempts, 316 passing yards, only 6 yards per attempt, but we have to love the insistence on letting him throw the ball and trusting him. 3-to-1 touchdown to interception ratio. What did you see from Mac Jones in his first game with Bill O'Brien as the play caller?
What Mac Jones, he's a very good processor. He's accurate in the short to intermediate game. And you know what? Bill O'Brien came in and played to his strengths against a very tough Eagles defense. So, we talked about this before we went on the air. Mac Jones outscored Patrick Mahomes in fantasy this week. So I don't think that should be the expectation every week. But Mac Jones is a guy that, I said on Twitter about a month ago, I don't quite think that Mac Jones is going to be this year's Jared Goff, but he has the best shot. I think that was a pretty strong take that's going in the right direction so far.
I would say so too. In the running back room, a strong take we had that looks like it's true through 1 week is that Ezekiel Elliott is not quite as washed as people think, and that he's probably going to be a thorn in the side to Ramondre Stevenson fantasy managers all season. Stevenson had 12 carries to Zeke's 7. Stevenson ran 34 routes to Zeke's 7, but Stevenson 6 targets on those 34 routes. Zeke actually had 7 targets, so more targets on half the routes. I do think Ramondre Stevenson is the clear guy that you should be starting in fantasy. He was out on the field a lot more, just playing more snaps than Zeke. But I think Zeke remains as kind of this borderline like hybrid bench stash versus throw him in the flex if you need it. And Ramondre Stevenson just looks like a fantasy RB2. I am not sold on Kendrick Bourne. He had 11 targets. He caught 6 for 64 yards and 2 scores. But one thing we've known for the past half decade with Kendrick Bourne is that he is not particularly good at earning targets consistently. I want to see another week from him. The one guy I'd recommend is Hunter Henry as a pickup. What a wild tight end week. I can't stop thinking about it. I believe he actually led tight end so far in receiving yards with 56. He caught 5 of 6 targets and he scored. When we turn to Miami, it's very exciting. Tua Tagovailoa drops back 45 times. All he does is complete 28 of those passes for 466 passing yards, throws 3 touchdowns. His 10.5 yards per attempt was very exciting. Even more exciting was that his average throw depth was 11, the highest among quarterbacks in week 1. You love to see a guy that's going to be accurate and push the ball downfield to his 2 elite speedsters in Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. Hill had the explosion with 215 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns. It looks like he is already in the running for fantasy wide receiver 1 overall. And then I'd say on the ground game, Raheem Mostert's a workhorse that might not matter. We like that he carried 10 times to Salvon Ahmed's 3. We like that he ran 32 routes to Salvon Ahmed's 13. But 10 carries, 2 targets just really doesn't get it done in fantasy week to week. We do like that he scored a touchdown, but hard to expect a touchdown every week with that little volume. It looks like similar to last year, this team is just going to flow through the passing game on offense. Talk to me about any other observations with the Patriots and the Dolphins And let's start with, did Tua look better than last year?
No, I mean, Tua showed great ceiling last year too. The one thing I'll say about this game is Mike McDaniel is an excellent game planner, wonderful play caller. I love that guy actually. And the Chargers are a very vulnerable run defense. You know what he says? Like, you know what? I don't care. This is what we do well. You stopped us last year. We're going to light you up this year. And that's what they did. Tyreek Hill, in my personal opinion, Tyreek Hill is the best wide receiver in football and has been for years. I think he's better than Justin Jefferson. I think he's one of the toughest covers in history. And, you know, he's one of these guys that can blow up almost more than anyone. Him and Jamar Chase, actually the three of them, him, Jamar Chase, and Jefferson are the three guys that can give you 200 yards and a touchdown or two. You know, then when you factor Jalen Waddle in the mix too, they're just such a tough matchup. I saw them run a lot of plays where they had multi-level crossers, where one short or one intermediate, one long, where they really hurt the Chargers with that. So big fan of that. And, you know, with the Patriots, we mentioned it before, their defense looked really good against Philly. They're familiar with the Dolphins. Tua usually struggles against New England. If maybe I'm misremembering that, but I don't think I am. I don't think he always beats them, but Tua usually has problems with New England. So I could see this game. I don't know what the spread is offhand, but I could see this game being a one-score game that's closer than people expect.
Let's turn to the two Monday Night Football games. First is the Carolina Panthers against the New Orleans Saints. What did you see from Bryce Young? Because if I am strictly looking at the stat sheet, I see 146 passing yards on 38 attempts, which is under 4 yards per attempt. Are you concerned about Bryce Young when there's really no receivers to throw to?
No, this is what I expected, you know, both from like a power ranking standpoint and offensive rookie of the year standpoint. The Panthers' first 6 games is their toughest schedule stretch. Then they get a bye. And then when they come off that, that's when I'm going to be curious to see who Bryce Young is. I saw some things that I really liked, you know, a couple. One of the things I love is ball fakes. If someone's very natural with ball fakes, that's something they work on. And he's very natural with ball fakes. He made a couple really quick decisions. Jesse Bates picked off 2 passes against him. You know, Jesse Bates is one of the best safeties in the league. The stat line certainly is concerning. Their wide receiver group certainly didn't help him at all. I think the Panthers have the answer at quarterback long term, but I think it's going to be rocky for the next few weeks.
Behind him, Miles Sanders had great usage at face value, 18 carries to Chuba Hubbard's 9, and 6 targets to Chuba's 2. The big issue was that Miles Sanders was terrible with the ball in his hands. And he's generally, yes, he's not generally a good pass catcher, but at least as a pure runner, he usually gets the job done. He did not in this contest. The 18 carries for 72 yards is a little deceiving. Next Gen Stats had him at leaving 1 yard per carry on the table per rush attempt. I don't care about these receivers. I do care about the tight end, though. I think Hayden Hurst leading the team with 7 targets, catching 5 for 41 yards and a touchdown. He had the only red zone target of the game from the Panthers. I think we should be pretty encouraged. He looks like an interesting late round tight end. Again, just a weird week for tight ends. And we've at this point given you 4 or 5 guys that you can consider on waivers. I think that what I will say, the caveat is that the names we mentioned could look very different in week 2. This is still a very, very volatile position. Let's turn to the Saints. Derek Carr took 4 sacks. He did complete 70% of his passes. He threw for more than 9 yards per attempt. 305 passing yards is a great debut. What did you see from him in his first Saints start?
Yeah, I mean, you know, we've talked about this all season too. Andy Dalton was actually decent last year, but Carr brings more ceiling. Carr made a few plays that Andy Dalton simply couldn't. On the other hand, the Titans, you know, gave up the most receiving yards to wide receivers last year, so Carr took advantage of it. Actually, kind of, you know, I like the over in this game. It ended up being a field goal game, so that's why it didn't get there. But, you know, at least for week 1, it looks like the Saints are in a better position on offense.
If we turn to the running backs, some people were angry because I said I think Jamal Williams is going to get all the work. He did, guys. He just didn't get there in fantasy. 18 of 19 running back carries, ran 24 routes to Tony Jones's 5. Both running back targets went to Jamal Williams. He had 12 expected fantasy points. He only scored 7. I don't know what to tell people out there. We are probably going to be starting him once again in week 2 against the Panthers. And I think there's 4 fantasy starters potentially against the Panthers for week 2, where obviously we have Chris Olave. I think we can add Michael Thomas, who caught 5 of 8 targets for 61 yards. He led the team with 3 red zone targets. He had a target in the end zone. That's all exciting. Tight end Juwan Johnson caught 3 of 5 passes for 36 yards. That's at least something. And then Rashid Shaheed, the field stretcher, stretched the field indeed. 5 of 6 targets he reeled in for 89 yards and a touchdown. And he had 2 of his targets come in the end zone. Would you say that all 4 of them are viable options for fantasy in week 2 against the Panthers? And what else do you want to add about this Saints team?
No, one thing I'll say is, yes, to your question, I think all 4 of them are viable starters. Juwan Johnson, it depends on your situation, but the other ones, yes, Williams at least until Kamara's back. And for this week, I watched every snap of the Falcons Panthers game so far, and I like Jamal Williams a whole lot more than I did against the Titans this coming week.
Yes. Let's turn to Monday Night Football. Second game, the final game that we'll be previewing ahead of week 2. It's the Pittsburgh Steelers against the Cleveland Browns in a divisional matchup. Kenny Pickett dropped back 46 times last week against the Niners, completed 31 passes, 5 yards per attempt is not great. He also took 5 sacks. We also saw Deontay Johnson leave early with a hamstring injury. We also saw Pat Freiermuth leave early with a chest injury. I'll be curious if Allen Robinson and Calvin Austin can step up without him there. I think one of the surprising ones was that Robinson led the team with 8 targets, catching 5 for 64 yards. He was someone that I enjoyed taking in the final round of best ball drafts. I didn't think anything of him for redraft, and with Deontay out, I'm going to give it one more week, but we might need to start realizing that Allen Robinson can be started until Deontay Johnson returns. What did you see from Pickett against the Niners? And are you concerned now that he won't have his target monster Deontay available against the Browns?
That's a loaded question for me. I'm going to give you a broad answer here, Josh. I'm going to touch on a lot of things.
Right.
First, I throw last week out pretty much. Like, there was no margin for anyone. 49ers pass rush dominated. There was very little separation the whole game. I do think Deontay Johnson being out's a problem. Calvin Austin, I've always liked them. I actually mistook him for Deontay Johnson a few times, which is obviously encouraging. Allen Robinson, we'll see what happens. He's a veteran, reliable. My concern here is, we just talked about this before. The Browns defense, looked a little bit like the Cowboys defense last week. So Pittsburgh's looks like they're getting 2 ultra talented defenses in a row. So even if they struggle against Cleveland this week a little bit, I'm still not super concerned about the Steelers offense.
A lot of people are very concerned with Najee Harris. I'm actually a little less concerned than some. He outsnapped Jaylen Warren 26-13 through 3 quarters, and the routes were 20-7 in favor of Najee Harris through 3 quarters as well. I'm not pounding the table that Najee Harris is actually incredible, but for some people freaking out, being like, "Oh, it's about to flip to Jaylen Warren," I don't think so. And it seems like you didn't see that either. If we turn to the Cleveland Browns, I'm just going to kick it right to you on Deshaun Watson. 55% of his passes completed, 5 yards per attempt. I'd say the 2 encouraging things here that I saw in the stat sheet were 315 air yards. His average depth of target of 11 tied Tua for highest of week 1. That's encouraging. We like Watson's arm. We like that he pushed the ball downfield, and we like that he carried 5 times for 45 yards and a touchdown. Is there any hope for Watson, who outplayed Burrow? But my novice film watching eyes still thought his decision-making looked a lot slower than his first 4 years with the Texans.
Yeah, he looked more like the guy last year than the guy from 2020 that was lighting people up. I'll say a few positive things. They moved him out of the pocket on purpose a lot last week, where he looked pretty good in those areas. He took contact as a runner. He's definitely an option in fantasy as a runner. That said, he skipped like 5 or 6 passes to guys that were wide open. He missed. I can't tell anymore with the numbers. It was either Amari Cooper or Elijah Moore. I think Moore's 8, Cooper's 2. That all breaks my brain. These guys not having numbers in the 80s. So one of them was wide open 40 yards downfield, and he airmailed it. Like I said before in the Bengals segment, the Browns could have really, really destroyed Cincinnati if Watson played like he used to be able to. But yeah, a little concerning for now, at least. Yeah.
I'd say one thing that's not concerning is Elijah Moore. Hard to tell his number at times. Like you said, he's 8, Cooper's 2. I remember Cooper was, I think, 19 with the Cowboys at one point. This is just a journey into absolute anarchy at this point with these wide receiver numbers. Elijah Moore tied Amari Cooper with 7 targets for the team lead. He caught 3 for 43 yards. He had a target in the red zone. The stat line isn't super exciting for him in the receiving game. I believe he had a carry for like 25 yards, if I remember correctly. Like he was getting scheme touches. I watched most of that game. And I think in general, it was just encouraging that it looks like his rookie year is a little more indicative of who he is than what we saw last year from him with the New York Jets. If we turn to the running back room, Nick Chubb outcarried Jerome Ford 16-4 through 3 quarters. The only reason that Ford had a ton of carries at the end was because he was just carrying the ball in the fourth quarter as they ran out the clock. Nick Chubb actually led Jerome Ford through 3 quarters, 11 routes to 9, and Chubb had 4 targets. What did you see from Nick Chubb in the receiving game? And then anything else that you want to add about this Browns defense?
If you have Nick Chubb in fantasy, one of the things that I loved about his usage in week 1 is that not only did he have like a higher target share than he normally did, there were 2 or 3 plays where the play was drawn up for him to catch pass. So that's very exciting if you have Nick Chubb in fantasy.
Yeah, I would agree there. Guys, thank you for tuning in. Ryan is at Ryan Reynolds NFL on Twitter. Make sure you're following him. All our work is free on the33rdteam.com. And if you're reading our articles, you'll see a lot of links to our free Discord where we're going to drop everything from start sit advice to leans on Survivor to DFS showdown advice to player prop bets. We are really funneling a ton of our content into Discord and onto the33rdteam.com. We'll be back, the two of us, on Thursday to break down the week 2 matchups more in depth. Until then, make sure to check out the Cover 5 show with Alex Caruso and Ben Wolby, which will be dropping midweek for fantasy football. From myself, from Ryan, from mybookie.com, from the 33rd team, thank you, everyone.